Welcome to Sustainable Conservation. This is actually our headquarters here that you're sitting in, so great to have you join us here today. It's a chance for some of you to get caught up on the work we do, but also hopefully for a lot of you a chance to learn about who we are and what we do and participate in a great conversation today. So thanks for making it out here. It's the first time we've done San Francisco Climate Week. So maybe I'll just start off with a little bit about us. Our mission is to advance collaborative stewardship of California's land, air, and water resources for the benefit of nature and people. And some important things in there are that collaborative stewardship. We're really based on the idea of working together with different stakeholders on problem solving. They may be communities, businesses, and in this case, folks in the agriculture and food sector, because it's really important that those solutions are practical and work for those industries, for those stakeholders. So by working together, we're finding things that actually will scale through their practical approach, but also we rely on those organizations to really do the scaling. We're a small catalyst is the way I think about that. Maybe it's all those years of biochemistry that I had to take in college. As a catalyst, we're too small to carry those solutions to scale, but by partnering with organizations, whether it's agricultural organizations, business organizations, regional government, and state government, that by problem solving together, they can take those solutions to scale. And that allows us to move on, to graduate our role to something that allows us the freedom to go tackle other parts of really complicated problems. We'll talk about water today, not a small problem. There's no single solution. You need a lot of tools in your toolkit. So it gives us the opportunity to work on new tools or to sometimes work on new problems. A couple of great examples of efforts that we have graduated to date, and really interesting. I learned about these only since I've joined this organization because they're not as obvious as to what we do today. But was removing copper in brake pads. The brake pad partnership was our first program, working with that industry to phase out copper in brake pads because copper is a water pollutant and was impacting ecosystems. And so that was accomplished first here in California by working with those businesses, and now is, as of last year, phased out nationally as well through policy. We also worked on what we call Plant Right, which was working with the big box stores to get invasive plants out of sales here in California. Another successful program that we no longer work on because those companies bought into it and they now carry that forward. So today we work on a number of different issues. Water for the Future, which is really focused on how can we replenish what is the largest water storage system we have in California, our underground reservoirs. And we'll probably touch upon some of those efforts in the conversation today. So how do we use that storage system, get water back in there rather than continue to deplete it? And how can we start thinking about transitioning demand on our water resources, particularly in the farming sector? We also work on solutions from the soil, looking at how farmers manage their soils and can the way they manage soils impact water quality and water quantity and have other environmental co-benefits that we might talk about. Accelerating restoration is, we've done some very hard and bureaucratic work to streamline or facilitate permitting for restoration of aquatic ecosystems, particularly streams and floodplains. Working through the bureaucracy of state and federal agencies to make sure that we can reduce the barriers for other organizations, public and private, to do stream restoration and help rebuild some of our fish that we value so much here in the state. And then lastly, our Waste Not program, looking at the use mostly of technology as a way to turn dairy manure from a pollutant into a potential resource, and some progress being made there. But today, we'll talk about agriculture. And so maybe just a little level set for those of you who maybe don't have a good grasp on California agriculture. California is one of the top 10 agricultural economies in the world. I know we're one of the top 4 economies, but agriculture, we're big too. It's generates over $60 billion in what's called farm gate revenue. So just the revenue coming off the farm, not from the food processing industries and all the other things that are reliant on it. We're the #1 dairy state in the United States. We produce 75% of our nation's salad greens, 80% of the carrots, and over 90% of the broccoli. So you can see we have a huge footprint on the U.S. food supply and really on some of the most nutritious parts of our food supply. We also produce 80% of the world's almonds and 40% of the world's pistachios here in California. And some of these guys produce those things. Agriculture has a big footprint in the economy and in our food supply. It also has a big environmental footprint. So it's about 8% of California's greenhouse gas emissions. About half of that comes from the animal industries, mostly dairy. And about 40% of fresh water use is used for growing food here in California. So an important opportunity to, in my view, demonstrate through California that we can produce food to some of the highest standards in the world and do so sustainably. So I hope that we keep that in mind because we do need to get food from somewhere, and I'd rather get it from a state that cares about producing high quality things to a high quality standard for the environment as well. So I think we have 3 great speakers here to help us understand what that really means in practice. So I have some questions to get us started, but we definitely want to get you all engaged in this. So we will turn to you if you have questions and join the conversation. So maybe I'll start out if each of you will introduce yourself and answer the question about what does climate resiliency mean to each of your operations? So first who you are, what you do, and then what does climate resiliency mean to you? Stuart, you got to start us off.
Well, for me, okay, so I'm a farmer. I'm running a family operation. It was started in about 1974. My mom and dad, my father was 57, started this thing. And in those earlier years, he had plenty of reliable water. And so their charge was to figure out, like, what are the crops that we could grow in California that we actually have like strategic advantage? We could grow them better here than elsewhere in the world. So almonds, processing tomatoes, pistachios. He was kind of early in a lot of those. And then today, I'm managing our family's legacy of land, and we don't have enough water. So my mission is like, how do I optimize these lands that we can't irrigate? How do we keep it together? And so climate resiliency for me is figuring out, recognizing we're not going to have maybe the water we would like to farm these very productive and diverse lands. Like what is an ongoing model and crops and land use or what have you that will allow me, our family, to pass this on to the next generation? It's going to be in a different form, but I'd love to see them receive it and be able to continue to grow it.
Great. Cora, you have a different side of the food supply.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Cora Snyder. I'm a senior program manager at the Pacific Institute, which is a nonprofit research organization focused on water resilience. And at the Pacific Institute, I lead an initiative called the California Water Resilience Initiative, which is led by corporations to help advance water resilience in partnership with state agencies and a variety of other partners across sectors in California. And that's championed by Ecolab and General Mills, but also in partnership with about 24 other companies who are sourcing ingredients from California, who are headquartered in California, or have other operations here. And the climate resilience question, I'm not going to be as concise as you would.
Please pull it out.
So I think, I was thinking about this morning, I think California agriculture, there's these kind of trifecta of challenges when it comes to climate resilience, particularly looking at it from the water lens, because that's really the lens that I bring. So first is declining water supply reliability, right? We have a shrinking snowpack, we have weather weirdification, right? More precipitation falling as rain than as snow, and this weather whiplash, really long hot droughts, and then these big flood events. So that's number one. And then we also have often increasing water demands at the same time, because that hotter, drier weather also means that plants need more water to survive. And so we have this imbalance between water supply and demand caused by climate change. And then the third element that I would add is kind of contending with a history of negative impacts from extractive practices, right? The impacts on people, communities, and ecosystems, clean air, clean water, right? How do we contend with impacts of agriculture at the same time that we're also trying to sustain it into a future of climate change? And so with those trifecta of challenges, I think what climate resilience means is investing in water storage and supply reliability. You mentioned groundwater, right? The storage beneath our feet, healthy soils that can store more water, and also making sure that the infrastructure that we have to store and convey water remains safe and reliable. I also think on the demand side, where there are opportunities to reduce water demands, changing crops to less water intensive crops, irrigation efficiency, right? There's this whole opportunity around technology to really optimize the way that we farm. And then also, when appropriate, transitioning land uses to something that uses much less water that's maybe not in agriculture. And then on that third pillar, right, how do we bring our agricultural systems into balance with ecosystems and communities, knowing that a resilient agricultural sector in California relies on resilient communities and ecosystems.
Great, back to another farmer.
Well said, yeah. So Cannon Michael, I run my family's farming operation in Merced County, a little town of Los Banos. So my third great grandfather came over from Germany in the 1850s, so I'm the sixth generation of the family to be involved with the business, and pretty cool today. I've got a seventh generationer sitting over there, my nephew, so that's a long history, but I'd say also from the larger business that when it started, my ancestor had a climate-inspired strategy. It was before a time when we had the infrastructure to manage water, and so he made his first investment in some cattle in 1858, and was fortunate that he'd purchased his first piece of land along the San Joaquin River, because as the valley water supplies shrunk, he was able to get close to the river. But then, as California does, in 1862, a couple of years later, it was like an inland sea, where we saw in 2023 just the massive amounts of the hydrology that can switch. And so he realized pretty quickly, better have the footprint to get away from the water and get close to the water. And so essentially inspired him to, and fortunate he was at the right place at the right time. California needed a stable food supply, and he was kind of one of the pioneers of stabilizing that food supply and feeding the massive amounts of people that were coming for all the opportunities and the gold rush and other things. And so as I think about leading our organization into the future and looking at the climate and the challenges that we face, I mean, I'd say it's really like adaptability for farmers, but at the same time, we've transitioned our farm from a cattle-only operation to a diversified vegetable, primarily and melon operation, and it's not, change in agriculture is really challenging because we're exposed to all these other things that are outside of our control, like price and pests, and then now you're throwing in this climate. And so, when we've established systems and practices over decades, which a lot of us do, we kind of make minor tweaks to our system every single year because, you're trying to always improve. But if you suddenly say, like, I'm not going to grow these crops and I'm going to start this whole nother process, or I'm going to start like regenerative agriculture, I'm going to take all these, changes, not only is that a change of practice agronomically, but also a lot of times it's a bandwidth and even capability of your own organization and your team. So I think we've got to be careful of these times when we think like we need to bring agriculture to the table, and we want to be at the table, but it's also, you've got to put it in the context of the amount of risk and challenge it is for us to take on new systems, take on new challenges, take on huge investments. Our farm is irrigated with 80% drip irrigation, and that was a huge investment in that technology, so we're using the least amount of water possible. At the same time, we're powering all of that energy demand, because that's a different, we're pressurizing water and pushing it out the field with electricity. So all of our electrical demand is offset by solar. Again, millions of dollars of investment, and the right thing to do from a perspective of stewardship of resources, but at the same time, if we don't have the water, to Stuart's point, of shrinking supply, the return on that investment goes to zero if I've put out all this capital to make these investments in doing the right thing and stewarding my resources, but I don't have the water to put through it. Then we're sitting there with a stranded asset, and we've really put ourselves at even more risk because I'm still paying the debt service and all these things. So anyway, it's a complicated conversation. I think agriculture, as Josette set us up for this, has to be a part of the conversation. 25+% of California's land mass, and a lot of really good opportunities for agriculture to be a part of the solution I see, and we'll kind of tease that out further. But anyway, great to be here, and look forward to the conversation.
Yeah. So you've each sort of set out the goal of what resilience means. Maybe now you could talk a little bit more detail about what are some of the specific things that you're doing in your operation to try to make you more resilient.
Yeah, so I figure with when Sigma's fully implemented and you look at kind of what's happened with our...
You got to say what's
Acronym alert.
Acronym.
Oh,
sorry.
Wait,
You can't
okay.
do that. You can't say
Okay, the State Groundwater Management Act.
Sustainable groundwater.
Thank you, something like that, I don't know. But
It's a law passed in the last drought that limits pumping of groundwater to make sure we get to sustainability.
as we kind of lost our surface supplies over time, shame on a lot of us, started pumping more, because we have a tomato processing facility, and believe it or not, we want to run tomatoes in it. And so anyway, we started pumping more, and suddenly our groundwater tables were being impacted. And so the state has come through and is restricting what we can pump. And once that's fully implemented, I figure we're going to have about 5,000 acres 5 to 6,000 acres annually that, is going to lay idle, which, as you point out, will continue to pay whatever indebtedness we have on it. All of our irrigation systems, all of that, we're kind of letting that infrastructure go. And we don't have confidence in the state coming forward and figuring out how to effectively capture flood flows during dry periods and get them in. I'm not going to make a bet on the state. So what we're doing is...
You should make a bet on us because we're working on that.
Well, I'll make a bet on you, but and you guys have done some really great work in that area. But so some of the things we're doing, which my father is rolling in his grave, that we're covering up a lot of our ground with solar panels and no longer farming this really great prime farmland that just doesn't have enough water. So we're generating some income from that under long-term leases. We're doing that. We also, when it does rain in our area, we're actually in a region around a little town of Huron where in Westlands they have a Corcoran clay layer. Water doesn't percolate down deep in the aquifer. Where we farm, there's no Corcoran clay layer. And so we've put in a number of ponding basins that we can bank and recharge. And if just think about that. We spend the money to go out and put in these basins, and each basin's maybe 10, 15, 20 acres. And then you sit back and you think, well, I hope it rains. Because you're not farming that anymore. You've put up, berms and everything. Our first year we did that, we banked like 45,000 acre feet. It was a wet winter. It rained like crazy. We were able to get we had to pay for it, but we paid to bank that water, and we banked it on behalf of others. And so that's one thing. Another thing we started doing, I really want to see our land go to the next generation if I can improve soil health. So we started getting in and, like 5, 6, 7,000 acres at a crack, we'd just cover it up with like cover crops. Mm-hmm. And then if it did rain and we got a decent crop, we may cut some of it and sell it to the dairy, but put everything else back into the soil. Just trying to generate a little income and improve the land. And so that's part of our rotation. We also moved some more water-intensive crops. We were guided by those at the almond board to plant almonds. And anyway.
Almond board would say they don't tell anyone to plant almonds. They just have to find markets for them when they do.
It's a crop that California just owns that. We do that kind of better than anyone. And anyway, we started moving those more water-intensive crops in other parts of the state. So we have our almonds now are located in Chico and Merced and even down in little pockets of like Arvin and what have you. And then lastly, and Cannon, I think, is just so tired of hearing about agave. But we started growing agave, and I happened to be a big fan of tequila and mezcal. And one night in a stupor, I was thinking, what could I be growing here that doesn't use much water?
Any water.
Any water. And believe it or not, this desert plant doesn't really use a lot of water. And so I started spending time going to Mexico, and now there's a group of us that are creating like a new category of spirits that are California agave spirits. And we're a long way from getting there. We're not that far away. I mean,
When can we get on the
so right
shelf is the question.
Right now I've planted like close to 600,000 of these plants over a 4-year period, and they're using 2 to 2.5 inches of water versus our tomatoes that are using closer to 30, or almonds 50, or pistachios 40, 48, 45, or whatever. But they actually, in areas where we're using a lot of drip and everything, eventually, when you're using drip, you concentrate any salts that you have in the water wherever the drip is. And so it's hard to save your way into prosperity because ultimately you end up getting little areas that have more salt concentration, and somewhere along the line, you got to flush those salts. And what that sometimes means is you then need to apply more water than you would have otherwise just to flush the salts. But anyway, so that's what I'm doing.
Complicated system. Cora.
Yeah, so I wanted to share 2 project examples that we've been working on through the California Water Resilience Initiative, and one was drip irrigation. So even though there are 3 challenges, so that it's called the Agricultural Modernization Fund, and we launched this last year. And 3 corporations in our network supported 5 small family farms. It was about 263 acres total, so very small farms. In modernizing their irrigation system, so upgrading to drip irrigation with basically a digital management system. So not only was it saving water, but it was also allowing them to more remotely manage their farm and improve the kind of optimization of their irrigation in general. So that was one project, and it was in partnership with the California Department of Food and Ag. So part of the state's, their SWEEP program, their water efficiency program, so the state is also supporting farmers in doing this, and this is part of what we're trying to do with the California Water Resilience Initiative, is build those public-private partnerships. So it was a cost share between corporations who are sourcing ingredients, who have water replenishment goals to replenish as much water as they use in California, in partnership with the state's broader efforts to advance these kind of efficient irrigation practices across the valley. So that was one project that we launched last year that I was really excited about. I think it's saving around 160 million gallons of water per year. And then the other one is still in development, and it's also in partnership with the state, and it's part of the state's multi-benefit land repurposing program, or MLRP. And this is led by the California Department of Conservation, really as a way to help with this transition to sustainable groundwater management. So Stuart mentioned SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. The reality of SGMA is that there is going to be major land use change across the state, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley. And the risk with this, there are many risks of this, but one of the dystopian future is that we have a bunch of dry, fallow fields that don't have water to irrigate their lands, and they are causing dust pollution, and they're not contributing to economic productivity. That is the future of SGMA that we don't want to see. And so the Department of Conservation, through this program, is helping to incentivize landowners to transition to lower water use land uses that also provide ecosystem and community benefits. So the state has been running this and incentivizing landowners across California. And what the California Water Resilience Initiative has been looking at is how can we allow corporations to help co-fund this, which might sound easy, but in reality, it's actually taken a lot of building new partnerships and new ways of constructing projects to facilitate corporate investment in this work that fits into their corporate sustainability programs and their water replenishment goals. So we are just at the point now where the project is open for corporate investment, and we have a few funders that have committed to funding the project. And what it is it's an almond orchard in Madera County that is going to be transitioned to native pollinator-friendly habitat. So taken out of agricultural production and instead native habitat. It's about 100 acres, and it's adjacent to a rural community that's reliant on domestic groundwater wells for their drinking water. And so this project is helping the transition to more sustainable groundwater management. It's supporting those rural communities, and it's also providing pollinator habitat and habitat for other species as well. So this is just 2 examples of how we're trying to work to improve resilience in agriculture and also sustain that transition to more sustainable groundwater management.
Cannon, over to you.
All right. So I took over the management of our farm in 2014, and I don't know if everybody remembers 2014-15, but it was a crushing drought for California, which is no surprise. And even my ancestor, who I said came from so long ago, one of his sayings was, California is always in a drought year until it proves itself otherwise. So that's, even though we're talking about climate and current situation, he actually had that quote from years ago. But so anyway, I was exposed, because of the historic nature of the farm, we actually have a better water situation than some other people in our area, Stuart and others. But that year, we were actually cut below our, what we call a critical year, because 14 and 15 were so bad, we actually were cut, even as senior water rights holders, we were cut back. So that was a big eye-opener for me leading the company, also to see that, you know, something I've had felt at one time was very secure suddenly was not as secure as I thought. I followed up in 2016. The state of California is very fond of adopting a lot of regulations. Any of you running businesses probably might know that, but what they did specifically towards, well, not specifically towards agriculture, they changed the minimum wage starting in 2016 was going to go up $1 an hour, regardless of where you were in the state, regardless of your industry. It was just going to be a blanket. So again, for agriculture, that was going to be that's a big increase in a business where we can't pass along those costs. Like, we don't get to decide, I get to add a little tiny bit to my every cup of coffee or whatever it is. You know, we have to absorb that cost. And the other thing that happened in 2016 at that same time was a change in the overtime law, where there's a federal exemption. So a lot of people don't know this. There's a federal exemption to paying agricultural workers overtime. California had already had a law out after 10 years, and it was going to ratchet down to, 10 hours a day, and it was going to ratchet down to after 8 hours a day, we're going to pay overtime. Anyway, so those 2 things coupled together, we're going to massively increase our costs. The climate issue was on my mind, so I thought we're going to have to be different, a different company today than we are, you know, in the next. We have to get on a transition to higher value, different practices, thinking about what the future was going to look like for us. So on the water side of the equation, dealing with the climate, we'd already invested quite a bit in drip irrigation. We continued those investments. We also started looking at some other crops with water demands that were different. Stuart's explaining about agave. For us, it was looking at carrots, garlic, and onions, which we call winter crops. They'd never been grown in our area to any scale, maybe in home gardens, but not at agricultural scale. And so we looked to find partners that we could work on those. So shifted about 20% of our water demand. So these are crops we're planting in January and February that by the time the heat of the summer comes, there's no water demand for those crops. We're harvesting those crops or letting them dry in the field. So that was a huge shift for us to make just a crop shift and demand shift. And then we picked up some other higher value crops with some partners and some double crop opportunities. So if the winter crops worked out and we grew those in the winter and we had enough water, we would be able to plant something like a melon or sweet corn and have 2 turns of the soil. If we didn't have the water, we could just let the field be fallow after that harvest, but get, you know, some economic value off that first part of the first crop that we were able to get. So those were kind of fundamental shifts. And it sounds probably easier than it was, because I was taking a team that was used to growing really 3 primary crops, and I was asking them to grow. I didn't describe everything that we shifted into, but we were growing 15 plus different crops and shifted to organic certified crops, which you're growing. They might be the same genetic material, but it's a different way of handling it. So it's almost like its own crop by itself. So shifted to organic, shifted to new crops, but again, a huge cultural shift internally because we were designed to just kind of do a few things and do them well. And so I'm asking a team to get agronomic advice from people that they hadn't like met before, partners that were trying to help us be successful. Some of my older guys were saying, you know, I don't care what that young guy's saying. I know how to farm. I don't want to listen to that. So I had to make some cultural shifts and changes, and that was really challenging to let people go who had been good long-time people, but they couldn't adapt and couldn't, you know, kind of get onto the new program. And agronomically, when you switch crops and you don't know how to grow them or don't have a long history, a lot of times it takes, you know, 3 years of experience to know whether you're going to be good at growing it. You can't grow one thing 1 year and decide whether you're going to keep on growing it. So there was another kind of multiple year investment, and it didn't go well. I'll just say it didn't go well. 2017, we lost a lot of money. 2018, didn't do very well. 2019, lost a lot of money. Had a lot of stress with the family going, you know, what's this guy doing? You know, nothing's working. You're firing people. You know, everything looked kind of crazy, but it has ultimately worked out. But it was certainly a challenging road to go down. At the same time, I had permitted a compost site on the farm. I had gotten introduced, so 2016 we permitted the site. I'd gotten introduced to a company that handles a lot of green waste in the state. The challenge with green waste going into the landfills is it's producing about 20% of the methane for California. And so by shifting that out of the landfills and onto our farms, we can produce organically certified compost in about 30 days. There's some ammonia released with composting, but it's not the same as the methane, obviously, that's coming out of the landfills. So anyway, so that program we've had in place, permitted in 2016, contracts in 2021, so it took a long time. So that was another one thing. I took land out of production to do this, and the family's scratching their head for 5 years while nothing's coming off this blank piece of dirt that used to produce our crops. But now we have this very active center, and we're getting a lot of material to put out onto the farm, improving the water resilience of our soil, water holding retention capacity, organic matter improvements on the soil, and then also not putting that material into the landfills, which is causing us a lot of the issues. So that was another one. There's a lot of other things, technology, even advances with, you know, we've got tech companies that are coming with cooling jackets for our workers, you know, startups that are trying to figure out just how to keep people comfortable in the field. We're doing a lot in the biodiversity aspect of the farm. I think we're building more resilience into the corridors that go through our farm and the areas that we don't farm that are native habitat, improving those, making more water access, planting pollinator-friendly plants to some of the conversation that's been happening. But I think we also have to look at, like, we are stewarding not only the agricultural resources, but we're stewarding a lot of biodiversity on our farms, and making sure that those aren't left behind in the climate discussion. I mean, we can try to armor up our farms, but I think we also need to armor up the biodiversity areas that we have that are really amazing parts of the story of California agriculture. Because I think we talk about, like, it's agriculture, environment, it's community, but in the Central Valley, these things are all woven together. They're not separate, distinct things. They are part of the whole functioning, and the holistic part of the valley is really that fabric that isn't one component, it's all of them together. But anyway, I'll push the button and stop. So.
Well, maybe just I'll add on that point to think about, if you think about the geography of California, I mean, we're all very aware of how much public lands we have. I think about 50% of our state is public lands, but it's really concentrated in the mountainous areas, whether it's the coastal range or the Sierras. And if you look at the amount of conserved lands in the Central Valley, it's very small. And so any kind of environmental goals, particularly around species that we have, monarch butterflies that transit over the Central Valley as part of their migration, kit foxes, certain bumblebees, there's lots of species that is their native habitat. You really can't get conservation of those species unless you engage agriculture. These people rightly own the land, they purchased it, it's been in their family. So if we want to achieve those species-related goals, in particular the biodiversity goals, we have to engage them in adding habitat where possible. And you can see from these examples here some great willingness to do that, and you know, from my time working in ag, also found, you know, farmers, most of you live on their farms. There's kind of this myth that there's a lot of corporate agriculture, and the reality is most farmers in California do live on their farms, and so they do care about what that environment looks like, and they are willing to step up, because pollinator habitat turns out to also be a lot of very pretty flowers, even if they're native flowers. So I found that was really interesting. And I maybe just see this as well, like as an example of ag being part of the solution. If we think about, for example, our climate goals in the state as a leader setting goals for carbon sequestration and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the two sides of that coin, you know, agricultural lands are being factored in by the state. It turns out orchards and vineyards, which permanent crops, sequester carbon. Not quite as long as a natural forest does, but sequester significant amounts of carbon relative to an annual crop that you're turning over the soil on a regular basis. And very importantly, agriculture has a lower carbon footprint than urban development. And as we look at the future with Sigma of more of that farmland coming out of production, if it ends up in suburban sprawl in the Central Valley, that's definitely not going to be rowing in the right direction for our climate goals. Always a double-edged sword. So Cora, you talked a little bit about supply chain engagement in the California Water Resiliency Initiative, but maybe talk, each of you talk a little bit more about the role of markets. Where has it been a positive factor, and where has it frankly been a challenge, either as a farmer or as someone engaged with food brands? Who wants to tackle that one? Start us off.
Yeah, I'll start. So we have some organic production, we have some regenerative production, we have relationships in the supply chain where we've had really some great partners that have actually put skin in the game, you know, you know, so I think we have 300 acres of bee-friendly weeds. We've got, you know, we've done a lot of these things and comply with a lot of our customers and what their sustainability initiatives are. But I would just say generally, I personally really wanted to get ourselves kind of to be relevant in the supply chain. And clearly as consumer interest in environmental issues and regenerative ag and organic production, you know, we took a hard look at this. And I don't know that Canada and I necessarily share the same view on this, but I've come to the conclusion, for me personally, I think producing more food at a lower price point to feed more people is a more noble effort than producing less food to get paid more to meet somebody's third party, you know, somebody that comes out and checks the boxes and all that kind of stuff. And over the course of time, I've found that we have more and more customers that want us to comply with all their sustainability initiatives and jump through various hoops, a lot of which we're already doing. But I'm not doing it because I think I'm going to get another dollar out of them. I think more often than I would love to see a list of those food companies in the supply chain that talk the most about how they're improving the environment, but what they actually do and what they fund. And I'd love to see a scorecard on that. I've come around to thinking I'm going to improve our soil health and use cover crops and farm differently because I think it's the right thing to do. And I'm not going to be beholden to H.J. Heinz and whoever owns them next to try to figure all that out. I think we have a pretty good idea of the land that we've been farming and managing and the things that I want to do that I think are right. And so I get conflicted on some of this stuff. And you know, you were talking about biodiversity, and I think that's absolutely right. You get, you know, when you put all these cover crops in, you get much more biodiversity. But that means good and bad. And as the Department of Pesticide Regulations continue to remove materials that we have some insects that we only have 1 or 2 products to use to actually protect something like a tomato crop. And if I'm got cover crops all over my land, and it's a breeding ground for some of these insects that just raise hell with us. I got to take that into account and figure out, it's not an easy, like if you do this, everything's great. It's just a series of other management issues and challenges that come with drip, cover cropping. I just got to add one other thing. I don't know why it's top of my mind, but keep in mind, farming, you think about the land that growers own and their workforce, you have a lot of capital, you have a lot of people all tied in, and ultimately you don't know until after you've planted your crops what your water allocations are going to be. So you think about that, you've got to plan for the worst, hope for the best, and you make like a series of decisions that are suboptimal all along the way. Well, they're optimal at the time, but when you get to the end, if you knew then what, you would make much better decisions. It's hard.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to talk about how you've seen corporations engage in a positive way. I mean, obviously bringing resources to the table is a big one, but particularly from the food brand side of things.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's really interesting, Stuart, I think, to hear on the on the ground level, because I'm often operating at that, the corporate sustainability level, and to hear the importance of, okay, we try something, and what are the actual outcomes? We think it might work like this, and then how do we make room to iterate and do what's going to work best, both at the farm level, and then how do we work that up to what the corporate sustainability goals are? So it's really helpful to hear your perspective. A lot of the companies that we're working with have set water stewardship targets. And so similar but different to a carbon offset, right, where companies are saying we're going to replenish the same amount of water that we use in our operations in the watersheds that we operate, right? And so carbon is the easiest comparison, but it's not a direct comparison because we all know that water is a very local resource. So carbon is a global pollutant. You can have a global market for it. Water doesn't work that way. It's much more localized, and the impacts and the benefits need to be seen at a local level. So these companies have said, I am going to replenish this volume of water in the Central Valley where I have my operations, where my water footprint is. And this is all voluntary, right? So these are voluntary commitments that companies are setting, but they are public targets. And so there is a need to make them robust and make sure that then we're actually tracking and measuring progress against those. And this is, I would say, probably the primary driver for companies to engage in the California Water Resilience Initiative right now. It's not the only one. Companies are also coming in because, especially the food companies want to see resilient agricultural supply chains, nature and biodiversity and watershed health is important to them, but many of them are coming because they have a public water target that they need to hit. And they're doing that by investing in projects like the ones that I shared, right? Improving irrigation efficiency, transitioning lands to save groundwater. Companies are investing in these projects, and then they are making a voluntary claim of how much water they helped to save or how much they helped to restore. So it's not exactly a market, but I would say that is a primary driver for corporate engagement. We're also seeing a big uptick and increase in biodiversity, and of course you would think water and biodiversity often go hand in hand, and the Pacific Institute has a whole body of work around nature-based solutions for watersheds, and just recently we helped publish a biodiversity benefit accounting guidance for companies so that we can start this process of how do we think about biodiversity benefits of water projects. So those are some of the ways that we're seeing companies engage.
Cannon.
Yeah, so
you grow a lot of things, so you have a lot of market supply chains
and
now.
Markets of course work, and I think for farmers, if they see that they can, if there's a clear market signal, we can find ways to make those changes and figure it out. I mean, to Stuart's point, doing something just because somebody watched, Kiss the Ground and saw cover crops and wants to do, these, there's things that are. I think corporations have to take the time to actually figure out if those ideas translate to the markets that they're working in. So I think there has to be a certain amount of intelligence about what people are trying, really ultimately to accomplish. But, the truth is these corporations are setting, really, visible public targets about, reducing emissions. A lot of corporate annual reports come out with a lot of goals, 2025, 2030, there's all these targets about reducing footprints, and those things are not gonna just happen. And I think we've got to find ways for us to, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Well, they're setting the targets, and they want you, but ultimately, you're the one that needs to figure out how to get them there.
Yeah.
The data is a tough one to move from the farm up the supply chain.
Sorry. Tired.
We'll stop seeding you answers to
No.
I've got other ideas.
Wow, that's funny. I just totally lost my train of thought. But I think agriculture is there to be able to help meet the goals and the targets that these corporations are putting out. But again, I think what we've done in a lot of ways is we've not been able to figure out how to incentivize the people who actually have to buy the agricultural products. So I think what we see is these targets set, but then when we say, look, like we need an extra 5 cents a pound, whether it's an apple or a pound of cotton or whatever it is, they'll say, well, that's going to ruin the margins, or that's going to, it's not going to work for us because it's, the board of directors is going to see, so on one hand, you've got this, corporate goal, but on the other hand, you're not going to dedicate the pot of money because the buyers who have to get the product in are always been trained for decades of we've got to buy at the lowest cost or at the market price. And so there's got to be a way, if the corporation is going to make that public statement, that they would be willing to put a pocket of dollars that they even could identify on an annual report or whatever it is to say, like, here's what we're actually spending towards that goal, and decouple it from the market and the buyers having to kind of take on that responsibility, because you'll see a margin erosion on those SKUs that people are buying. If it's, so we've got regenerative programs and things like that where, we're saying, look, like, we're going to need to, if we're going to comply with you, we're going to need some additional incentive to do that. But at the same time, the buyer side, so there's often an internal friction. And one thing on biodiversity I did want to mention is that I think everybody talks about it and would say in this room, like, biodiversity is a positive. Stuart highlighted, the possibility of bringing in some other species that could damage another crop. When we're doing food safety, crops that have a food safety requirement, like watermelons or anything that's direct to consumer, fresh market tomatoes, a lot of the things that we do that go directly from us to the store, essentially. When we're being audited by these third parties to, the buyers, the big suppliers, the Costco's, the Albertsons, these folks have their auditors come and make sure that the farm, essentially they want it to be like a sterile laboratory environment where we don't have any biodiversity, because we're literally punished for, if there's a bird in the field or if there's, a coyote runs by. So it's something I think all of us as a public has to think about, is that we're talking about biodiversity and wanting that to be, I think everybody in the room would say we want to see, different birds and species and all these things running around on these farms, but at the same time that flies in the face of a lot of the food safety requirements that we have, and so puts us in direct conflict. So the more investments I'm making in biodiversity are actually putting me in a lot more risk with the food safety compliance that we have to go through. So another aspect. Sorry for zoning out there for a second.
That's all right. Challenges to work out that interface with the marketplace, and sort of, I think you guys all made some really important points where corporations have pressure themselves to do the right thing. They have shareholders that are holding them accountable, and there can be activism around shareholders in some cases. Even investment can be tied to certain environmental theses for corporations. And so they have pressures on themselves. And so then they set these goals, and they have to be able to account for them, because there's legal liability and reputational liability. But they're not always accounting for what that means down on the farm in terms of, is that even a reasonable practice to be doing? And then very much potentially pushing the risk down on the farmer and not giving that in any kind of form of reward. So still a lot of work in that food industry. Companies want to reduce their risk, have predictability. And I think hearing from the farmers, that's like everything but in farming. There's not a lot of predictability, and there's a lot of risk that comes at you that you have no control over. Let's see, I've got 3 questions, but I want to open it up. So maybe I'm just going to go with this one next. So maybe particularly for you, Stuart, and Cannon, you are not only farmers, but you're also members of communities. And Cora, you mentioned the fact that particularly in the Central Valley, it's estimated that 500,000 to 1 million of agricultural acres will come out of production to get to our groundwater management goals. That's a lot of land, and that's a lot of jobs and economy. So how are you, what are some of your hopes and concerns for particularly the Central Valley as you watch that process take place on your own land and in your communities?
Well, I'm trying to figure out, so this is a story of adaptation, right? So what are the crops that we could grow where we can continue to employ and continue to utilize our land? But that is a really narrow funnel. There's a reason why we're not harvesting a bunch of pineapples in the desert or, whatever. There are very few crops that really require next to nothing in terms of water. And through the years, and Cannon, I'm sure you've had this where people, well, why don't you consider growing, dry farming heirloom grains? Well, because we lose money doing that, we actually have to generate some income or growing all kinds of stuff that, you just, in our region, in our area, it just doesn't work. And so
it's expensive to farm in California
it's
compared to a lot of
expensive.
places.
It's
Yeah.
expensive to farm, and you just can't save your way into a profit and not give a crop not what it needs. You gotta take care of it. You gotta grow something that you can actually economically fight another day with.
I mean, the number of 500,000 to 1 million acres, that's a big, that's a soundbite that of course gets a lot of attention. I mean, I would say you've got to start with I think to me, the premise that was all that land supposed to be farmed? I mean, that's going to be something that a lot of my ag friends would not like me to say necessarily, but I mean, I think the truth of the matter is that if you can be objective and step back and just look at it from a fair lens, there's been a fair amount of unsustainable behavior in the valley. There's been land that never had a contract to water. Stuart's families, they did go to an area that was contracted with the federal government for water, and for many, many years they established their business on very reliable allocations of water. You can argue whether that was the right thing to do to give them that water at that time, but that was the contract and that's what they got for multi-generations, and so they established those. But that doesn't take into account the number of areas that we call white areas, which were never served by either the state project or the Central Valley project or any of the tributaries. It was just land that was, native land that was brought in because of, really there was quite a bit of economic rush about the almonds and pistachios became something that became very lucrative. A lot of people, a lot of pension funds, a lot of people that are, there's a lot to think about around agriculture. I'm a capitalist. I believe in free markets. I believe in all those things, but there's something about resource extraction for corporate level, like portfolio, wealth that is just different than being a multi-generation farmer that lives in the community and your kids go to the school and you participate in the local, charity events and do all, So, I mean, there is a reconciliation, I think, in some of that we need to be mindful of. So what I would say on the counter to that is I do think that there's some acres that have to come out of production and that should come out of production, and that's where we need to Cora's point, how do we transition those to things that are beneficial still, whether that be like what Stuart doing with solar, habitat corridors, because we can't have a patchwork of habitat. It's got to be connected corridors if we can do it intelligently. But I would just want to leave folks with the idea that losing California acres that should be sustainable and that we can encourage. We don't want to lose good California farmers, and that's. We're getting to a point where with all the variables and all the costs and all the challenges, climate included, pests, weather, I mean, if we don't we said California is an expensive place to do business, and that's because we have a lot of the things in place that are the right things, which are worker protection, environmental protection. There's a lot of things that you get with a California product that you don't get with anywhere else, but at the same time, we've destroyed seasonality. nobody thinks about when they go to this, you want what you want when you want it. If you want a blueberry, you want a blueberry. If it came from Chile, if it came from wherever, nobody cares. And now we've divorced ourselves even further from the food supply by, groceries, now they just come from here. They don't even, people used to go think the food came from the store. Now it comes from your iPhone. So we've just gotten one step further away even from that connection to agriculture. And I think, those are things that we need to think about. And, I think, the California public is voting for people to be in power of making regulations that do protect the environment and do protect, people. But at the same time, I don't think a lot of us are always thinking about like, hey, I know that that's not in season, that I should be waiting for California to be producing that, or is this from California? So if we don't get some recognition of some of that, we are going to lose a lot of good family farms and smaller farms. We're seeing consolidation because people just can't keep up. I mean, the small farmers don't have the bandwidth to take on new technology. I mean, Stuart and I are talking about how we're adopting all these new systems and doing all these things. I mean, there's a lot of small 300-400 acre farms that, I mean, even if you gave them 100% paid for a drip system, they wouldn't want it because they don't know how to grow processing tomatoes, and they don't maybe have the younger kids on the farm who want to learn those things. So I think we have to be mindful of like all those aspects and what is the California agriculture we want to see in the future. I mean, I would say too, like bigger isn't always bad. I mean, we're larger than other farms, but I mean, that also allows us a lot of social programs for our folks and a lot of other like good investments that we make in our communities. So it's a balance between all these things. But anyway, it's not exactly on the climate anymore, but a lot of thoughts in there, community.
But you bring in something that I find really interesting in the climate policy arena. We talk about this term leakage, that you don't want to put in place policies in one place that create leakage to another place, that the industries will move somewhere else where there'll be more damaging from a climate perspective than in the place where they started, so that you basically push the problem somewhere else. And yet, in effect, that is a conversation that we don't have for so many other things. And I would just layer that as someone who's worked internationally for a good portion of my career, that we look at Europe, which has huge subsidies for agriculture. And what that means is that farmers can be made whole to have the ability to comply with a lot of high standards of regulation, which is sort of analogous to what we have here in California. And to have the bucolic landscapes that you can drive around and enjoy, and to have the small family farms, and to know their food comes locally. So it's a tough balancing act. I'm not suggesting that's where we need to go, but you guys are kind of caught in the crosshairs of that.
I would rather have a competitive environment for agriculture than any farm program.
Yeah.
I think that's another thing where you read about these farm programs and everybody assumes, God, the farmers are just ringing the bell on that thing.
Right.
I don't know if we can take any more assistance from President Trump on tariffs and trade and, whatever. I mean,
Strait of Hormuz, in case any of your products go through there. Yeah, all those nuts going to the Middle East.
Yeah.
Can you say more about what you meant by that?
Yeah, I'm going to open it up now to
so
questions.
If
So
you
perfect.
think about something like tariffs, and where California, we actually export a lot of these products. You're growing 80% of the almonds, or what was 96% of the processing tomatoes, or whatever. We depend on exports, and we've spent decades building markets all over the world to suddenly just have those totally called into question. And then I would never pick on the president. But, when somebody comes forward and says, well, we're going to have a program to help offset some of that, you can't offer a program big enough to offset the harm that's being done to a lot of the trade channels. And, I mean, how long is it going to take for us to get back to where we were with Canada?
Yeah, we have a relationship where we sell our organic cotton to a company in Italy, and they've been to the farm, they love us, we have a great relationship. But all this tariff stuff, they've said, look, we're buying to design for programs and collections that come out, in multiple months later. Like we can't we can't like not know, like, because of these tariffs. 1 minute it's 5%, 1 minute it's 50%. We can buy organic cotton from Peru, and like, yeah, it's not from you, but we'd rather stick with you, but we can't deal with that kind of swing. And so there just is a small example of where you would have, you know, a group that wants to source from us, but they're starting to say, you guys are not reliable partners for us anymore. We can't really. And so again, that market's then gone. So I can get a check from the federal government maybe that says like, look, hey, we understand your business has been disrupted. We're going to give you a handout, but that handout's going to go away. There's going to be a new administration, and at the same time, I've lost the relationship with a customer that was a good person to buy from, and that's the long-term future of our company. So those are the long-term ramifications, what Stuart's talking about, that you can't just put back together right away.
Yeah, I mean, talk to some farmers in the Midwest and that grow corn or soybeans, and they both will tell you that the subsidies in those commodities reduce the risk of growing those commodities, but it also reduces the incentive to diversify and to try other crops and to make those kind of investments, because you know kind of what your minimum risk is with a subsidy program that you have for the big commodities. At the same time, they are the most impacted by some of the tariffs, because they have depended on a very small number of markets. And unlike almonds, they're competing against low-cost producers in South America. I mean, the reason we grow a lot of these particular commodities in California is that it's very high cost of farming, and so you need to grow something that has a pretty high potential price, and you don't want to be growing a lot of stuff that you can grow in Mexico or China, because you're competing against some very low-cost producers. And that is why we have a lot of almonds and pistachios and processing tomatoes and so forth.
Well,
and agave.
No, I'll tell you, I grow almonds because I run all of our budgets on the return per acre foot of water. And where can I earn the most for that drop of water? Yep. And even though an almond may be water intensive, I may be better off, you know, laying 1 acre fallow to get enough water to grow that one, and I'll earn more per acre foot. You know, at the end of the day, you got to look at the whole
Sure.
and can you actually do it? But I think that's what's triggered a lot of production, and I think a lot of people think, well, why are you growing these water intensive crops? We just grow fewer of them, but we make more than growing row crops. And
Right.
anyway, that's why. We're competing.
Yeah. Other questions, comments from the audience?
One comment, one question. First, I think you guys are like teachers, like unsung heroes. So thank you for your craft that you've developed and maintained, and are looking to pass on to the next generations. And my question is, we've talked a lot about markets and macro level, but as takeaways for individuals and families here, what is the best way we can support you? Like, what's the best thing we can do for you as we weed through?
That's a great question.
Yeah, Cannon, I'm going to turn that over to you.
I mean, I think just be aware. I mean, as much as you can. I mean, if there's a chance to wait, and I mean, just like re-explore seasonality a little bit, and some of that I think is important. I mean, you get a better experience usually overall, and we're doing our best, you know, to put forth the best melons and the better tasting. You know, we've switched from cantaloupes for a while. They were giving us these genetics that were something you could ship across the country, and it would taste like a piece of cardboard, no matter if it was right off the field or right, you know. But retailers but you know, consumer behavior like drives a lot of that. But yeah, just think about where things are coming from, and if you can wait, you know, a month for getting a better experience on a watermelon or whatever it is. I think it's just small things. And Stuart mentioned, you know, affordability a little bit, and I think that's an important thing. Like, we need to think about the food system. Everybody should have access to fresh, local food, and that's why, like, this food is medicine thing, I think the more people we can get on board with thinking about like our health and how we can solve it without pharmaceuticals, and how we can solve it by eating healthier diets. And so again, those are things like, you know, some of this Maha stuff is kind of crazy, and the only thing that's come out of it that I think is at all positive is a little bit of that focus of, you know, like, let's think about like some of these food systems and how they can have a better impact, because I firmly believe like the way you eat can actually fundamentally change some of that. So, you know, that's voting for people who feel that same way, and it's, you know, it's going to be a long process, but you know, the pressure is real for us as farmers. I mean, we're under a lot of strain in terms of, you know, just trying to do all the right things and trying to keep up with everything, but it's a lot of pressure.
I think leaving here with like an appreciation for, everybody thinks the business they're in, well, you should appreciate the business I'm in, But honestly, in the Valley, what I love about the Valley, just these wide open spaces and fields. And I think it's a great part of California that gets kind of underappreciated from policymakers, wherever they may be. And it's something that we do really, really well. And I think the numbers are like the ownership in California of these farming operations, it's something like in the mid-90s are family-owned farming operations, right? And so, yeah, the venture groups that are coming in or investment groups, these guys are not going to be investing in our communities. And I don't want to say they're bad neighbors, they're just different neighbors. And anyway, thank you for your appreciation of.
Get off 5 and 99 and check out some of those cool towns, because we have not depopulated. There you go. Well, that's a great one too. Yes.
Yeah, Jason Morrison with the Pacific Institute. So I want to build on this question a little bit, and it's about whether there's a premium that could be added to California produce because it's internalizing these social and environmental benefits, and whether those that you're selling to outside of California, can that be monetized in a way that they would be willing to pay that premium for better tasting produce produced in ways that was fair to farmers, farm workers, and were environmentally helpful?
It's a good question. I mean, there's been the California grown movement, but I don't know that it's ever gotten that much traction. And I would just say now, because of the rigid regulatory environment here, there's a lot of great California companies that are now farming in Mexico, other states. So like Driscoll's, for example, not to single them out, but I mean, they're in Salinas and started in California, but essentially have huge operations now south of the border. So they're not very invested in saying anymore that like, hey, source from California. And that's true not just with Driscoll's, but with a lot of others. So unfortunately, there's a lot of now contrary, I think you get a lot of pushback from guys saying like, hey, we want to really focus on, because these guys have left because of the regulatory, like Hillmar Cheese is a big milk cheese producer. Now they've got huge operations in Texas and all these other, so they don't want to go like Happy Cows anymore in California. They want to say, buy our stuff from wherever, because it's all, so yeah, so I don't know that there's no easy answer there.
We're trying it. We created a standard of identity for California agave spirits. Like if you use the term California, you've got to comply with a host of different things, and your specifications have to meet like the highest level of, and we're going to find out whether or not, it makes a difference.
Great. Maybe one or two questions, and then we'll allow just mingling. Needy, you want to go? If I'm pronouncing your name right.
My name's Nidhi. I'm curious, you talked about the incredible pressures and risks upon risks upon risks that you have to take on. Are there any pre-contracts or like data simulation or GIS? Like what would help you plan more responsibly?
Well, in our own case, so we have processing facilities as well, and we enter into a lot of term contracts. So we know at least, like our tomato processing plant, every year we start, it's about 95% sold. And we have strong customers and we know they're gonna take it. We just don't know whether or not we're gonna fundamentally have the resources to produce all of it. So you kind of, I don't wanna say we over-contract, but you contract in different areas, thinking some areas may have better water reliability, some are a little more challenging. And so you try to mitigate risk whenever you can, but it's not that easy.
Yeah, and I think, for us, when we diversified our crop mix, we also went with some of the crops that actually had a contract price ahead of time. So if we did our job to grow the crop properly with the quality and the quantity that we thought we could do, then we could make a return. So, we've diversified our risk portfolio that way. We're investing a lot in technology. I mean, we're, exploring what AI means. We're exploring robotics, autonomous, weeding solutions. I mean, it's kind of like an all of the above strategy, but it's yeah, it's constant investment, constant trying to figure out like what else can help us be more efficient. You know, unfortunately, shed as many people as we can, which is a horrible, you know, thing to think about, but it's like we just people a human unit in a ag business is, in any business in California, is so expensive. You know, and it's just all these changes that have been made. You know, the overtime thing that got changed, it actually has hurt the workers because California is the only state who's changed. So a couple other states have adopted ag overtime, but at the same time they've given the farmers who pay the overtime a direct tax credit, so a little bit of a break. And so that just takes off some of that sting of, yeah, we can pay overtime, but if we have no way to offset any of that additional cost, what we're doing is we're cutting hours and we're finding either double shifts or something because we just can't afford to just pay this infinite amount of overtime. And ag is a business where it's seasonal and where you've got these windows of time where people want to work 10, 12, that's when they make all their money, is like in the time when that's, you know, you make hay while the sun shines is what people say. But, you know, so there's going to be times when there's not as much work. And so, you know, again, we're getting policies dictated by groups that are saying that they represent farm workers, but they represent 4,000 out of the 400,000, but they're the ones who have the voice in Sacramento to drive policy. So, I mean, there's just a lot of things going on that make it challenging.
So fundamentally, like when we're selling our crops, I always tell like our guys, you know, we're about a penny away always from losing the business. And it's, if you're a penny a pound too high on tomato paste, or if you're a penny higher in pistachio, you know, they have choices, the buyers, and they can say they want you to do all these kind of things. But at the end of the day, the buyer is going to make the best buying decision. And generally, when you're selling commodities in mature markets, that's about buying it a little cheaper than the next guy. And every time you have a new buyer in one of these companies that you've established this long-term relationship, strategic, the new buyer is going to try to buy it a little bit cheaper than his predecessor. And it's just this never-ending, that's what I love about farming.
Well, I was going to say, you're going to finish on a very dour note there, but thank you for bringing us back, Stuart. I want to thank you guys for everything.